wanted to interview him beforehand to get all of his what do they call it? CV. Yes, yes. So uh, I'm going to give him permission to do his own thing about that, and so you know you're going to be hearing the truth about his background. So here you go.
Okay, thank you. I don't need that. Well, tonight I'm going to speak to you as a part of the youngest cohort of physicians who practiced obstetrics and gynecology before Roe v. Wade became the law of the land. Now, actually, I happen to be an intern. Is this too loud? I think so. Let me move it down. Is that better? I happened to be an intern in 1972 and 1973, and Roe v. Wade officially became the law of the land in January of 1973. So it was my first 7 months, if you will, as an intern while abortion in this country was illegal. Standing here today, I didn't think I would ever be standing at a time when it was once more becoming illegal or illegal in many of our states, but so be it. So I'm going to talk some personally about my experiences, and then I'll share some facts with you. I'm not here to change anyone's mind. Abortion and your feelings about it are very personal, but I am here to provide some information more than anything else. So you should know that I serve on several data safety monitoring boards for the National Institutes of Health, for a pharmaceutical company, and for several Chinese universities. In science, we believe the Chinese are not competitors, but are collaborators. And I have been to China at least half a dozen times to meet with them. I co-chair a World Health Organization task force on female infertility. I am a member of the ethics committee of the society I used to run, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. I ran it for 13 years. I was, and you should know this, the medical director of Planned Parenthood of southwestern Ohio and northern Kentucky for about 3 years, and I never performed an abortion there, though clearly we had 12 clinics. Abortions were performed 2 half days each week in one of the sites, and represented about 3% of the business, which is about what they represent nationally for Planned Parenthood. I did serve as an ex officio member. Okay. I did serve as an ex officio member of the Medical Advisory Board of Planned Parenthood Federation of America for about 14 years. And you should know that I'm presenting my personal views, not the views of the medical school here. And I will mention off-label uses of various drugs because it's impossible to discuss medicine without so doing. Now, what I hope at the end is that you will be aware of some of the complications associated with illegal abortions, that you'll know a little bit more about mifepristone, RU-486, that you can talk about the evolution of abortion procedures over the past 50 years, which has been truly dramatic, and discuss some of the current ramifications of the recent Supreme Court decision in Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization. So with that, let's begin with my first experience with abortion on my third year OB-GYN clerkship at the University of Michigan. And please understand, I grew up in Elkhart, Indiana, 50 miles south of here. I never really thought about abortion. We just knew that occasionally a young woman in the class would disappear for several months, and there'd be some comments about she must have gone somewhere for some reason, and we all knew what the reason was, right? And that was it. But at Michigan, on my OB-GYN clerkship, one day an abortion was listed. And needless to say, I was assigned to go to that D&C and to observe it. And the story was that this was a young woman who already had 2 or 3 children, I don't really remember at this point, and really didn't wish another one and attempted to commit suicide. She was on the psychiatric ward. The psychiatrist thought that she was a threat to herself. An OBGYN thought she was a threat to herself. And at U of M, one of the few places in Michigan before Roe v. Wade, abortions were performed if it was felt that the life of the woman was at risk and 2 physicians would so certify. So I watched this D&C on a woman who was about 10 weeks pregnant, and that was the last I saw. Now, please remember that at that point in time, oops, let me go back. There was a 1931 Michigan law, and it provided that anyone attempting to assist a patient to obtain a miscarriage, unless the same shall have been necessary to preserve the life of such woman, shall be guilty of a felony. And in case of death of such a pregnant woman, be thereby produced, the offense shall be deemed manslaughter. And I want you all to appreciate that this law was in effect until the current Congress, state legislature, which repealed it. So it has been repealed now in the state of Michigan. Now, I went to do my residency at Parkland Hospital, one of the largest county hospitals in the United States, the teaching hospital of the University of Texas Southwestern. And in that first 6 months, this is what we saw. We saw 12 incomplete abortions. That's the medical term, now called a miscarriage officially. 12 miscarriages every single day. But here was the problem. 6 were spontaneous, and 6 were illegally induced. And the women who had those miscarriages illegally induced were not about to tell us generally if they were legally induced or not. And we also knew who the 2 practitioners were in town. I don't know if they were physicians, but we knew their names, who performed these. And the way they were done is one of them basically inserted a metal instrument into the uterus. This will cause a miscarriage. The other inserted a urinary catheter into the uterus, packed the uterus with gauze, told the woman to take out the gauze when she started cramping, and in both cases, go to Parkland when you start bleeding. Now, the problem in those days was that if you had one of these miscarriages that were induced, you had a very significant chance of developing sepsis. And sepsis can be life-threatening. So our protocol was that anytime we suspected or believed that the pregnancy had been induced to miscarry, we admitted the patients for 3 days, 72 hours, of continuous intravenous antibiotics. Didn't have the array of antibiotics that we have today. Okay, this is 50 years ago, right? Okay, we saw 1 uterine perforation a week that necessitated, in those days, not laparoscopy, but a laparotomy and 6 weeks of recovery. We saw 1 case of renal failure associated with this each week, and we performed 1 hysterectomy a month, 12 a year, on patients for damage done to them by these illegal abortions. We also buried 2 to 4 people a year in 1 city at 1 hospital. Okay, I would also make the comment to you that our chairman thought this was so big a problem that in December of that year, he wrote a letter to the CDC to ask them to send an investigator because he said we were having an epidemic of illegal abortions in the city. That investigator never showed up because, of course, by the end of January, Roe v. Wade was the law of the land. Now, interestingly, after January 22nd, when that passed, within 1 week, the faculty began an abortion clinic. And I remember one night being on call with one of our very religious, went to Mass every day, Catholic faculty members. And I said to him, Dr. Santos, tell me, I see that you're on the list because we get a schedule and you're doing abortions there 1/2 day a week. How can you do this? He said, Dr. Rebar, I've been here for 20 years. Do you know what I've seen over 20 years of being here? I have no problems going to sleep at night because I know these women will still come in and will still want to have abortions, and I would rather they be done correctly than they not be done correctly and be a problem. The residents began performing abortions later, and we did abortions in those days 2 ways. One was by dilation and curettage, vaginally, and the other was by hysterotomy, which for all practical purposes is a C-section. And we were not skilled with doing D&Cs on pregnancies. So anybody further along than 12 weeks had an abdominal incision, an incision in the uterus, and was committed in those days to cesarean sections from that point on, a major operation to terminate the pregnancy. Now, let me give you a few relevant asides before I go on. There has been an evolution of techniques for abortion. At the time, we really had sharp D&C, dilation and curettage, and suction. And the suction device would scare the devil out of you because it was a large instrument that sat by the bedside, made a terrible noise to create a suction. And if you did this and the patient merely had a local, it would certainly scare the devil out of her as well. Since then, plastic flexible cannulas have been developed, and aspiration can be done really with a syringe on it as opposed to this noisy, terrible machine. I already indicated to you that hysterotomies were done for anything over 14 weeks, for certain. But shortly thereafter, it was learned that you could instill saline or urea or a combination into the uterus, but remember, ultrasound doesn't exist to any extent, to basically cause the death of the fetus in utero, so it would be expelled because the woman would go into labor. And then, as time went on, people became facile at doing dilations and evacuations. And that means being able to do a D&C on someone 14 weeks along or more. And today, people are facile at doing these up to 22 to 24 weeks, which is the limits of viability. That was not the case at that point in time. Now, this has ramifications for even what happened in Kalamazoo, even when I got here 8 years ago, because it turns out there were only 1 or 2 physicians in town who felt sufficiently facile with D&Es to do this on individuals who came in with dead fetuses or abnormalities incompatible with life. And so at Bronson Hospital, what they often did is basically use oxytocin, which puts people in labor, and sometimes takes up to 72 hours to take a woman with a dead early fetus to go into labor. And where were they housed? Labor and delivery. So think about being on labor and delivery for 3 days and hearing the neighboring rooms and getting oxytocin to cause cramping in order to expel a dead fetus. And there were 1 or 2 physicians that did do D&Es here, rarely, but many of them, when I arrived here, what was done was exactly what I said to you. I would call it barbarism. But that was the only way to terminate the pregnancy. The reason you don't want a dead fetus to continue, because over time, the individual can develop sepsis or can start bleeding from everywhere, DIC, diffuse intravascular coagulopathy. So you do need to eliminate this, if you will, abscess cavity within the uterus. Okay, now the terms that are used for surgical abortion include vacuum aspiration, suction D&C, suction aspiration, sharp D&C, and D&E. And I want you to notice I have not used the word partial birth abortion. There is no such thing. This is a political term that was created and not a medical term. Now, I did my fellowship, and I actually interrupted my residency at the National Institutes of Health. And two of the people I worked with are shown here, Judy Vaitakaitis and Griff Ross. And I had the opportunity to do research with both of them and to see patients with both of them. And they're responsible for the pregnancy tests that we have today. They were the first to develop the antibodies that are used in virtually every pregnancy test today. And their papers were pretty primitive when I got there. But the pregnancy tests that are sufficiently sensitive to actually determine a pregnancy before a missed menstrual period really didn't come into being until about 15 years ago. Until that point in time, we didn't even know that people were pregnant on the basis of pregnancy tests until about 8 weeks, and maybe a little earlier. When I was at the NIH, I ran a fertility clinic, and the radiologist there was experimenting with ultrasound. And the ultrasound was pretty primitive, and he said to me, he says, every time you see a woman that you believe is pregnant, would you send her to me so I could do an ultrasound? I just want to see what's going on. And I'll never forget the day that he called me in 1974 and said, Bob, you got to come down and see this. You've got twins. Here are the twins. And this is from a Polaroid photograph that he took of the ultrasound device. And he labeled it 1 and 2. And I took a picture of the photograph to show you. Now, I'm not going to show you 3D ultrasound. I'm going to show you what we can do today with just routine ultrasound through pregnancy. So you can see the changes that have occurred over the ensuing almost 50 years. And indeed, we could do much better than this if we had 3D ultrasound, which is very rare. And to my knowledge, there's one instrument in town now, and that's actually at WMed, and it just came in a few weeks ago for 3D ultrasound. Now, I haven't said anything about why arbitrarily saying no abortions after 6 or 8 weeks is wrong, but let me explain it to you. It turns out that it is the standard of practice to assess every woman's pregnancy, if she so desires, for structural abnormalities. And this is typically done at 20 weeks and often at 22 weeks. And the reason it's done then is because ultrasound still isn't very sensitive in order to be able to do it with assurance earlier. And having said that, it is at that point in time that many women learn that they have a pregnancy with a complication that is incompatible with life. And then, if there's nothing you can do about it, the woman is forced to continue that pregnancy for another 20 weeks. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. Okay. Now, I subsequently went to the University of California, San Diego, and I was on the faculty there from 1976 to 1984. And I must admit, the hospital did do some abortions. It was the only hospital in San Diego at the time that did them, the University Hospital. And having said that, there was one elderly gentleman who stood there day after day picketing. He knew us all by name. He was very congenial. Every time I went by, which is frequently because my lab and my office were across the street from the hospital, and I walked right by him whenever I went to see patients, he would say to me, "Hello, Dr. Rebar, how are you today?" Somehow we've lost that congeniality, even though he was there with his picketing signs every single day the whole time I was there. He was retired. Now, on the right side here is actually a picture that I took of a cloth picture that hangs in my study today that is a representation from Leonardo da Vinci. And it was given to me by a patient of mine who unfortunately had 2 mid-trimester abortions because she had Tay-Sachs disease. Needless to say, she was an attorney. married to an attorney, and they came in and told me with infertility that they knew they were carriers for Tay-Sachs. And she asked me personally to do the amniocenteses, and I did, and each time they were affected. And they looked at me and said, "We want you to do the abortion." I did not normally do abortions at UCSD. And we did have an abortion nurse for mid-trimester abortions, and they were done with a combination of saline and urea, and the nurse had everything set up. And the reason you added the urea is because you ensured that as soon as you instilled it, literally speaking, that the fetus died. I have to tell you that we had no place to house them except labor and delivery. And once the fetus dies, the woman goes into labor. You add oxytocin. Remember, this is before we could do the D&Es. And each time her husband came with her, and I can tell you he suffered more than she did. He was vomiting, he was pale, he was deathly ill, just watching this happen to her. Subsequently, she adopted a child, and that's when she made this for me. It is three-dimensional, though it doesn't show up here, and gave it to me. And she came back a third time after her child was 1 or 2 years old. And indeed, we induced ovulation again for this anovulatory woman, and she did become pregnant and have a child that was normal. I will tell you then that she regarded the 2 children as her children, including the adopted child. I mean, she was truly a remarkable woman to be willing to go through this a third time. That third pregnancy, by the way, after 2 of those saline urea abortions, was complicated by what we call an incompetent cervix. And actually, the obstetrician decided to make home visits so she didn't have to come in until she was ready for delivery. Now, when I was in San Diego, it turned out that the chairman of the department was a world-renowned endocrinologist, and one of his friends was Etienne Bouliot. And actually, I met and had dinner with and listened to him on more than one occasion. Etienne is still alive today. I looked him up, and it turns out he heads an aging institute in France. He's almost 100 today, okay? At the time, he was the head of INSERM, which is regarded as, if you will, it's the equivalent of the head of the National Institutes of Health in France. Okay, so he was a big deal. And he is the father of mifepristone, RU486. And his research was geared to understanding what caused pregnancies to continue. And that's what he spoke about. Here's Etienne on the left. Yes, yes. Oh, Tay-Sachs. Tay-Sachs is a inherited syndrome found in Jewish families, typically. By the way, French Canadians have the same problem. Eskimos have the same problem. Some of the tribes of Eskimos have the same problem. And it turns out that it is associated with normal birth, but progressive mental restriction, such that they always die by 3 to 4 years of age. And they never get to the point where they can raise their head. And if they do, it regresses. It's a terrible, terrible disease. Does that help for people who didn't know what Tay-Sachs was? Okay, and Etienne got a chemist by the name of Dr. Teusch and convinced him to create this compound, mifepristone, RU486. At the time, Etienne also dealt with a French company, Rousseau Uclaf, and they synthesized RU486. You can see how simple it is. That's the chemical structure in the middle there. It's a steroid. It's an anti-progestin agent, and you need progesterone to continue a pregnancy, okay? And it was first available in France in 1987 and used for abortions. It was approved in the US in 2000. Right now, through all the rest of the world, Western world, it is approved for use until 12 weeks of gestation. In the US, it's only approved through 10 weeks of gestation, 2 weeks less than in the rest of the world. It is on the World Health Organization's list, and there are about 35 drugs on this, of essential medications because of the number of illegal abortions and sepsis and deaths that occur worldwide. And possible uses include medication abortion, but it is recommended today by the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology for use in early pregnancy losses rather than doing a D&C. If you were a woman, would you rather have an operation and be put to sleep, or would you rather take a pill? And that is the recommendation today because of the experience from abortions with this medication. It can be used, not in the United States, for emergency contraception. It is used in many countries to treat fibroids and endometriosis, not here. And it is the best drug for a rare cancer, adrenal cancer. And I have used it in the treatment of adrenal cancer since I was trained as an endocrinologist. Oh, just adrenal carcinoma that doesn't, it's, yeah, yeah. Now, it is typically used with misoprostol, and misoprostol is a prostaglandin analog. And in Michigan, prostaglandins were first developed by the Upjohn Company. So this was the originator of all the prostaglandins that really were produced. Now, misoprostol has many other uses. It's used commonly today for induction of labor. It's used postpartum for bleeding in uterine when the uterus fails to contract and there's excessive bleeding. It's used for early pregnancy losses with mifepristone. I told you that's the recommendation today. And it can be used for the prevention of gastric ulcers when you're taking nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs that are commonly used. So these drugs have a lot of uses other than just for abortion. Now, it's been argued that mifepristone isn't safe. Here are the worldwide statistics. 5 deaths per million uses of mifepristone. Penicillin, 20 deaths. Viagra, 49 deaths per million uses. So this has nothing to do with drug safety. This is a political argument, if you will. Okay. Now, at the University of Cincinnati, and I was there as the department chair from 1988 to 2000, I had occasion to be involved in several instances regarding abortion. One of the people I became friendly with was a doctor, and I put his initials in parentheses just because of the fact to remind me of the story. And he told me about the fact that he was the first obstetrician in Cincinnati who did illegal abortions before they were legal. And he actually did have an abortion clinic in Cincinnati. By the way, he also had a home on Torch Lake, and I visited him up there when I was in Cincinnati. So he was frequently in Michigan because he had a sailboat up there. In any event, he told me that what he did for wealthy people is he got 5 or 6 together and they rented an airplane. And they flew in the air. Why? Cincinnati's on the border of Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana. And he said that way, when they were doing the abortions, the police would never know where it was done and how to charge them. And he said to me, he says, you wouldn't believe the people whose daughters and wives and friends, quote unquote, that I've aborted over the years illegally. At Cincinnati, one of my tasks was I was responsible for a course for the medical school students called Human Sexuality. And the person who really led the course was a professor at Northern Kentucky University who ran a similar course for undergraduates. He told me the story about one semester. He was teaching this class to a seminar to about 15 students, and a young man and woman came up to him and said, we live together and I'm pregnant. What do I do about it? And he actually gave them a list of names of where they could go. Now, they were legal at this point in time. You have to appreciate it. And she had an abortion, and this was in the middle of the semester. At the end of the semester, they came back to him and said, "You wouldn't believe it, we're pregnant again." And he said, "Well, why didn't you use any contraception?" He said, "Well, you know, we'd been together for 3 years before we got pregnant the first time. We just didn't think it would happen again once it happened once." And he pointed out to me, he said, they both got A's in the course. Now, one time I had to sign as the residency director and the chair all of the case lists for the graduating residents. I had 2 residents who were Mormons, and I knew they didn't do abortions. And I looked at their list, and I was signing them in my office, and I got up to go to the mailbox right across the hall. And one of them was there, and one of them had said he did 10 abortions in his time, and another had done 4. And the one that had done 10 was standing there. I said, "How could you possibly have done 10 abortions?" He said, "Well, Dr. Rebar, you know what the law is in Ohio. If there is an ultrasound heartbeat and the pregnancy is terminated, it's an abortion in this state." And these were people who showed up in labor and delivery with ectopics or in the emergency room or with sepsis. And if you have a septic uterus, even with a viable fetus, it is effectively an abscess. It needs to be drained. Pregnancy will not continue. The only thing you do by delaying it is increase the chances of the woman dying. And he said to me, he says, "I have no qualms about any case I was involved in. I would do them again. I will do them again when I return to Utah," which is where he is today. Now, we also had a faculty member join us from the military. He'd been at the Air Force Base in Illinois. And Neil said to me when he arrived, he says, "You know, I've been in the Air Force for 12 years. I plan to stay there forever. But," he says, "let me tell you about what happened this past year. I had a woman come in who was a private, married to a private, and as was and is the standard of care, we got a measurement, a blood test for alpha fetoprotein at 12 to 14 weeks. It was abnormal. Ultrasound wasn't that good, but even if it were, might not have shown anything. If it's abnormal, the standard is to repeat it in 2 weeks. Still true today. It was repeated. It was abnormal again. So we had to do an ultrasound. But you know, we can't really see anything until about 18 weeks. So we waited to 18 weeks, and the baby had no head and no brain, anencephalic. And so I had the unfortunate task of telling this woman that she had a non-viable pregnancy. But interestingly, anencephalic pregnancies go on beyond 40 weeks. They typically can go up to 45 or 46 weeks. And she said, "You know, everybody already is congratulating me, and now that you tell me this, I want this pregnancy terminated." And he says, "Well, you know, I'm in the military, you're in the military, I'm not allowed to do it here." And he said, "But I'll ask the base commander." And he did, was refused. So he worked his way up the chain of command all the way to the Secretary of the Air Force and the Secretary of Defense, and each place he was denied. By that time, she was 20 weeks, and he told her, "I can't do it." And she said, "Well, what can I do?" And she said, "Well, you can go to St. Louis or to Kansas City, and there are people there that will do pregnancy terminations up till 22 weeks. And she said, "Well, I want it done." He said, "Well, what's the cost?" And at that time, and this is several years ago, it was about $2,000. And she said, "I don't have $2,000. Well, the OB-GYN clinic faculty, nurses, staff were so upset, they raised the money to send her for that abortion. And when his time came up to re-enlist, he didn't. He was on the faculty with us for a few years, then decided to become a specialist in high-risk pregnancies, and he practices in Iowa today. And the whole time he was with us, he gave an ethics talk to each of our students about what you're allowed to do and what you should do and what is right. And he couldn't believe that the government mandated he perform the tests because that's the standard of practice, but then wouldn't let him act on the results. What about the dean? The dean was a really amazing guy. He unfortunately has passed away. He told me that he was a medical student at Harvard before 1965 when Griswold versus Connecticut was enlisted. And he was on his third year service, and he said, we had an abortion ward. And he said, we're making rounds one day, and the faculty member said, okay, send this person home. And they were illegal abortions, you know, and the woman had been here. And he says, well, who's going to talk to her about contraception? And the dean looked at him, pointed at him, and said, be quiet. And he said, yeah, but what about contraception for this woman? He said, please be quiet. And he said, but I don't understand. We need to talk to her about contraception. And he said, go home now. Be in my office at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. It was illegal to talk about contraception prior to 1965. So that was what was imparted to him the following morning. When I was there as a faculty member and he was the dean, his daughter went to Harvard, and he told me that his daughter's roommate became pregnant and she wanted an early trimester abortion and asked his daughter to go with her. As she walked to the Planned Parenthood clinic, they were spit upon and surrounded by people. And he said, she's traumatized by what happened to her. She's absolutely traumatized. How can this be allowed to happen? Needless to say, the law has changed since then, but that is what he told me. I told you I was the medical director of Planned Parenthood. I spent half a day there as an administrator. I spent a half a day seeing complicated patients for contraception there. I came in one day and I had to walk past to get to my office there, the waiting room where abortions were done that half day. And there was a woman, just one woman, crying. And I walked over to her and sat down next to her and I said, what's the matter? And she sobbed and said, I don't want to have an abortion. And I said, well, you don't need to have an abortion. We're not forcing you to have an abortion. And she says, I know. She says, but my doctor tells me if I don't have it, I'm going to die. And I said, pardon me? She said, he told me I'm going to die. So I went back and spoke to the woman who still does abortions in Cincinnati at Planned Parenthood. And I said, Roz, what's going on? She pulled out the letter from the internist. This woman had myocarditis after her last pregnancy and was told if she got pregnant again, because her cardiac output was less than 20% of normal, that she was going to die and that she had at least an 8 in 10 chance of dying during that pregnancy unless she had it terminated. She said to me also, she said, I don't have any living relatives, and I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. I would tell you she used some bad judgment, but are we going to doom her to dying because of the fact that she's now 10 to 12 weeks pregnant? And I said to Roz, why are we doing this here? Why aren't we doing it in the hospital? And she said, you remember, at your hospital, the only one that does them, it's over $2,000 for an abortion, and the hospital's done that on purpose so that none of them are done there. But we charge $200, which she can afford in her job. And I said, so I stayed until she had recovered and went home, needless to say. And she went home with contraception that was different from the birth control pills that she admitted she sometimes forgot to take. And forgetting to take a pill or two can be sufficient to lead to ovulation with the low-dose pills that we have today. Okay, let me turn to the World Health Organization. In 1994, this is what they said in Cairo. Reproductive rights rest on the recognition of the basic right of all couples and individuals to decide freely and responsibly the number, spacing, and timing of their children, and to have the information and means to do so, and the right to attain the highest standard of sexual and reproductive health. They also have the right of all to make decisions concerning reproduction free of discrimination, coercion, and violence. This statement was adopted by over 90 countries. This was during Bill Clinton's time in office. You'll notice 1994. There's one prominent country that did not sign on to the declaration. Who was it? the United States. Why not? Because it suggested that abortions could be done by women and they had reproductive choice. Indeed, the World Health Organization has said that there are three basic choices that women should have: whether and with whom to have sex, whether and when to become pregnant, and to continue or terminate the pregnancy. And the US has never signed on to that statement because Congress would never pass it to this day. Now, how safe is pregnancy? Best data I have, and I made a table for you from an article that appeared now about a decade ago in British medical journals from Britain. And the risk of dying in the UK, a civilized country, right? 1 in 8,200 pregnancies. Now take a look at the risk of dying from general anesthesia at that time, 185,000. And it goes on: hang gliding, scuba diving, rock climbing, canoeing, fairground rides, rail travel, air travel. So pregnancy isn't all that safe. And we forget that sometimes. Now, with regard to the US and the world, in 2017, and these data come from the Guttmacher Foundation, which is a great source of data, 810 women died from preventable causes related to pregnancy and childbirth every single day in 2017. Hasn't changed, and this is across the world, okay? And live births, maternal mortality rates did drop between 2000 and 2017 by over a third. But the majority of deaths, it's true, occur in low-resource countries, and it's also true that teenagers have a much higher risk than do elderly. And the major complications that account for these deaths: severe bleeding, mostly after childbirth, infections, usually after childbirth, high blood pressure, complications from delivery, and then take a look at the last one here: unsafe abortion worldwide, which is why mifepristone is on the list of essential drugs from the World Health Organization. Now, if you take a look at countries, the more contraception and abortion are restricted worldwide, the worse are the pregnancy outcomes. Maternal mortality is increased. Preterm births and complications related to prematurity are increased. And if you take a look at the US, and these data change as the laws change, but this is as of about a year ago, okay, the 10 states in the US with the most active restrictions on abortion are also 10 of the states with the worst maternal and child health indices. That's a fact. You can look it up. Now, the major reason for having abortions in the US, again, Guttmacher Institute, concern for responsibility to others, inability to afford a child, belief that having a baby would interfere with work, school, or the ability to care for dependents. I don't know if you know this. If you have a child before you graduated from high school, the chance in this country of graduating from college approach 1%. So clearly, it significantly limits the future of the individuals involved. There are many consequences in the US, and I've summarized what the Guttmacher Institute website says, that the consequences are unwanted children, increased children on welfare, increased homelessness, increased school dropouts, increased children with disabilities, and increased cost to society. That's just a summary. Okay, what about Michigan? In 2020, again, according to Guttmacher, there were over 30,000 abortions in the state of Michigan out of about 2.2 million women between the ages of 15 and 49. That's 16.8 abortions per 1,000 women between 15 and 44. 87% of counties in Michigan do not have an abortion provider, did not in 2017, meaning that about a third live in a county without an abortion provider. But that's not to be unexpected, since many of our counties are rural, if you will. But just giving you data in Michigan. And what about the laws in Michigan? And by the way, as I was driving here today, I heard more about this on NPR radio. So I'll make a comment about that. The state constitution now, as you know, protects abortion rights. Abortion is banned at fetal viability in this state, which is 24 weeks. That's generally the case in most states. Nobody does an abortion after about 22 weeks. It just doesn't happen, in spite of what some might have you believe. State Medicaid and private health insurance coverage are banned. Parental consent or notice is required for a minor under 18 abortion. Only physicians in the state can provide abortions, not nurse practitioners, for example, or nurse midwives, both of whom can be trained to perform these admirably. There are unnecessary regulations with regard to the width of the halls and the size of the rooms in order to prevent abortions at clinics and mandate they be done in hospitals where hospitals say they can't be done, or the cost is excessive, as was the case at my hospital, University of Cincinnati. We did very, very few abortions because the cost was excessive. So unless it was covered by insurance, nobody was going to go there. The state provides protections from harassment and physical harm for anyone entering a clinic, and the state has a shield law to protect providers from investigations by other states, which may cover support organizations as well. It's not clear, it's not been tested in court more than anything else. Now, I will tell you that what I heard on the way here is that the Democrats are trying to get rid of these laws that basically prevent abortions being done in a clinic setting. But it turns out that one of the people who had said she would support it announced today that she would not. And the vote is so close in Michigan that they do not know that they have the votes to pass these. And they left off on purpose the parental consent because they thought that was too controversial about whether parents should be consulted for people under 18 years of age. So it is not clear that any of these restrictions will be removed in the state of Michigan. Now, what about the impact of the Dobbs decision on OB-GYN in general? Every day in the bulletins I get from ACOG, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, there are comments about the number of physicians in various states. And physicians are choosing to leave or not practice new practices in states in which even counseling may be regarded as criminal. In fact, medical students are less and less applying to those states. Just in the last few days, I spoke with one of our top students here who was applying in OB-GYN, and she said to me, I don't want to ever do abortions routinely in my clinic, but I clearly want to be cognizant of how to deal with complications and how to treat people with problems. And for this, I need to know how to use mifepristone and misoprostol and to be versed in suction abortion. I looked at her list, which is what she discussed with me. She's applying to no state that has any restrictions. And that's what we're seeing happening. We don't know where this is going to end. Interestingly, when Dobbs became the law of the land, residency programs in OB-GYN passed a regulation that you must provide the opportunity for every residency to offer training in family planning. However, individual residents have the ability to opt out. It's not opt in, it's opt out. So they need not go. So as a consequence, I will tell you that we do have a young woman on the faculty who works part-time at Planned Parenthood who is trained in complex family planning, is trained in how to do D&Es to 22 weeks. And she did her fellowship at Johns Hopkins and her residency in Cleveland. And she's getting calls from Ohio and Indiana from the residency programs asking that their residents be allowed to come here. But she has first an obligation to any of our residents who choose to have such training. And that's what's happening nationwide. And indeed, she also tells me that the number of abortions they're doing from out-of-state patients has more than doubled in the time that she's been here, which is really less than a year. IVF centers, what about them? They're now sending frozen embryos for storage to other states because they're worried when you unfreeze, when you thaw embryos, some of them don't survive. They're worried that they would be accused of murder. So they're basically saying, if I'm in a state like that, I'm not going to take that chance. You have to go elsewhere to get your frozen embryos implanted. And now many cycles are such that no embryo is transferred during the cycle in which the IVF is done. They're all frozen and taken care of in subsequent cycles. Organizations such as the one I ran, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, are quietly urging states to pass law protecting fertility centers, but they're afraid to do so. And our political arm is afraid to do so because there's fear that once congressmen and lawyers recognize that there are losses that occurred naturally, they're just going to consider that all this is abortion as a means of shutting down infertility centers. So there's very little done, if you will. Now, what I've said to you is state laws are not about restricting induced abortion. They are about restricting induced abortion. They're not about protecting or improving the health of women. This is a fallacy. The best paper that I can share with you in that regard was published a few years ago by a fellow who's now retired, David Grimes. It was called The Conscience of OBGYN. He worked at the CDC for many years. And he published a paper in 2012 looking at CDC data from 1998 to 2005. And the mortality rate for abortion, and these are surgical abortions, not medical, which are even safer than the surgical, was 0.6 per 100,000 versus a maternal mortality rate in this country of 8.8 per 100,000 live births. So surgical abortions are many-fold safer than taking a pregnancy to term. And the laws that have arisen are political laws. They are not geared with dealing with women's health. Now, as I put this talk together, sat in my study, this is the view from my study. It was a cloudy day as I looked over the lake and contemplated what I was going to say to you tonight. But I tried to hopefully just tell you what is the status and what my personal experiences have been over the years. I will admit to you that I am unelectable. When I was asked, as we all were, when the resident clinic opened up at Parkland, would I do them? I thought to myself, and I'd never considered the issue before, how can I say no with what I saw in just 6 months? And virtually none of our residents said no, though to be sure there were a couple, and I admit that, because this is a personal issue and one that you have to live with. And over the years in my office, I've been asked to perform abortions on patients for various reasons, and I have done so. When I was at Northwestern, I was in the operating room at the same time as the abortion clinic was going on, and it was adjacent. And I will admit, when the two people who covered it were on vacation or at a conference, they often asked me to be the faculty attending. So I can't even tell you how many I did, because I had to step in and observe and be prepared to step in whenever the residents were learning how to do abortions as well. Well, with that, I will say thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Just a statistical question. I had heard that somewhere between 25 and 40% of all pregnancies end up in natural miscarriages. Is that correct?
It is correct, and it may be higher. The best data are old. They come from the island of Guam, which is a captive population, and they very early drew blood samples from all the women there, and the suggestion was about a quarter of pregnancies end before you even know you're pregnant, and then about 25 or 30% end after you know you're pregnant. So it may be as high as a half of all human pregnancies end up in a spontaneous loss. True. Yes. Barb? It's funny. It's funny you should say that because the same thing happened in Cincinnati. It was a new building, and I will tell you that when I came there, we had a conference in the front conference room, which had a great big round window in front of it. And I will also tell you that across the street was a 3-story apartment building. And when I agreed to become their medical director, and I did so because I had a large grant from the federal government to study new forms of barrier contraception that would also be effective against HIV. And that grant continues to the present day, not by me, but when I left Cincinnati, I gave it to my co-investigator. He's now the chairman of the department, and he has continued that grant to the present time. I never stayed in front of that window because if you stood there, it was a bullseye to the apartment buildings across the street. And the first thing they did when I agreed to do it is they gave me a bulletproof vest, which, for what it's worth, I never used. I put it in a file cabinet, um, but that was the case. Same thing. The building was destroyed in Cincinnati, across the street from one of the hospitals.
Actually, wasn't a physician shot to death
Yes.
not too long ago? No, I think most of the member knew Dr. Rangras. He's not here tonight, but he put two videos on YouTube explaining to medical students here in Kalamazoo about his time in India with the abortion, with the induced abortion, and the woman who tried to abort the uterus. One of the case was very striking. I remember he said patient came to the emergency room with a big flatworm tinea, which lives in the large bowel. It was in the vagina because they perforated the posterior part of the uterus into the anterior part of the rectum through the pouch of Douglas, and from there the content came in the vagina. This is the tragedy that will happen when we do things like this, when you restrict the will of the woman, if for good reason they want to have the baby within the first 22 weeks before they are viable outside. Things like this happen every day, everywhere in the world. And we can't just deny it, put your head into sand that says this doesn't exist.
Well, as you may have gathered, and I'm not speaking for WMed, I'm opposed to a 6-week cutoff. I'm opposed to a 15-week cutoff just for the circumstances that I saw for you. And I certainly do subscribe to what Bill and Hillary Clinton both said, abortions should be legal but rare. And the point is, there will always be these terrible situations. We can't eliminate them. And just to make arbitrary rules without understanding the physiology or the process of pregnancy just strikes me as not appropriate.
Laws,
Yes, I know.
and there is a confluence between the law and medicine in this area. You pointed out Roe and Dobbs, uh, both of which were based upon, uh, I'm going to say, almost procedural issues in terms of the law and not substantive ones. The word life is only mentioned once in the Constitution. That's in the 14th Amendment. And it says, life, liberty, and property shall not be deprived without due process of law. Due process is that procedural maze that we go through with hearings and confrontation and cross-examination and appeals. You docs help us out when it comes to death, you give us a criteria where we can define that and unplug the machines and start the probate estate. Uh, in terms of the words in the Constitution and your subject, when does human life begin?
Well, that's an interesting question that has become more complex in the last decade, and let me explain why. It turns out that we used to say, and by the way, the word conception is not a medical term, it is a legal term, at the moment of conception. But it turns out that we now recognize that when a sperm and an egg unite, it doesn't happen in an instant. It's a process that takes many hours. And so the question is, the real question we're talking about, and this is what I and the ethicists in the room, I would turn to and say, when does ensoulment occur? That's really what we're talking about. When is there a soul? Does an anencephalic fetus that has no brain have a soul? Or is it a blob of living tissue like a tree? Those are the kind of questions that we have to deal with. And as you know, you say there are questions about death. People are questioning what is death now and whether you ought to be dealing with cardiac death, brain death, what kind of death. So these are really complex issues, and I don't know that I can stand here and answer them. I can only tell you what I have seen and what I've been exposed to. And by the way, I have one time seen a woman come in following an illegal abortion with bowel hanging out the vagina.
Well, question over here, or just a comment. You use the term ensoulment, but that in itself is
Yeah.
a value term that not all of us accept.
Exactly.
You ask, what is life? Not when does it begin, but what is life? And the old mind-body duality from Descartes is not something that every religion accepts,
Yes.
and people who are not non-religious. So
Yeah, these are difficult questions, to be sure. Again, I was trying to provide you with some background and facts.
Grow all kinds of cells in culture. They can have beating hearts. We now have models for developing embryos. You can get the embryo up to about, I think, about 4 or 6 weeks.
14 days in a
14
human.
days, yeah. So just because something has a beating heart doesn't mean it's human. And something that has brain cells doesn't mean it's human. So there's some link between the biology and viability after birth.
Let me bring that up. I have talked about this previously. It turns out that there is something called the 14-day rule. And the 14-day rule basically says that if you culture embryos in vitro, you can do it to 14 days. Now, the reason for 14 days is there's no bilaterality until the 14th day. And that's because there's no neural system until the 14th day. And this originated originally in England. It's actually the law in England. It's not a law here. And it turns out that now it's between 14 and 22 days that all organs develop. And if you want to know when all these abnormalities that we detect at 20 weeks arise, they arise between 14 weeks and 22 weeks. And they arise in utero or in the early embryo between days 14 and 22. So there is a push now internationally to say that this 14-day rule that was developed over a decade ago should be changed. I will share with you that investigators at Rockefeller, investigators at UCLA that are connected to Cambridge, and investigators at UCSF, and perhaps at Columbia and Cornell are now culturing embryos and pushing that 14 days. And they are arguing that if we could do this, we would be able to detect and understand what caused fetal abnormalities that are incompatible with death. And this would be a tremendous advance forward. So it's a great debate. And I would also tell you that we can now detect a heartbeat, quote unquote, and I'm going to come back to that, in embryos that are smaller than the size of the clicker on the pen, on the end of a pen. The problem is this: what we're detecting is not a heartbeat. We're detecting a cell with a timekeeper in it. And we can see even a couple cells that are temporally contracting, and it's a precursor of the heart. It's not a heart. It's just cells at that point in time when it's defined as a heartbeat. And we know that from ultrasound and from culture. Susan?
I think you said fetal viability was 24 weeks?
You know, fetal viability is changing. I said
Well, that's what I
22 to
wanted to-
24 weeks.
Yeah. With improving technology, will it go below that?
I don't know what the lower limits are. Just this last week, I read an article about the artificial uterus in which they're pushing to be allowed to do this in people. They've done it in pigs and lambs, but there have been some problems with it. Basically taking fetal lambs and pigs and putting them in a water bath, if you will, and also cannulating the umbilical vessels, that are normally attached to the placenta. We don't know the answer to that question. What we do know, almost invariably, I have looked at our young woman who I told you was trained to 22 weeks at the cases she did that were above 18 weeks. They were all for fetal anomalies incompatible with life. That's what was referred to Johns Hopkins. So these people were either going to be required to carry them to term, or they were going to have terminations. And they chose to have terminations, which are less expensive and less associated with mortality and morbidity.
The cost of procedures to rescue a fetus, a very young fetus, is going to be extremely high.
7 figures.
Yeah.
I think we've run out of questions, but this has
Sure.
been a fascinating topic for us all to learn so much more than we knew when we came in this evening. Thank you very much. Surely. Let's give them a hand.